In August of 2017, the American Psychological Association, the APA, they conducted their annual Stress in America survey where they investigate Americans' relationship to stress. How stressed we feel, what keeps us up at night, how we handle our stress. And what they're continuing to discover is that stress levels among Americans are at an all-time high. Now, traditionally, money and work have always been at the top of the list of stressors. But this year, the APA added an additional question with an additional list of stressors, and what they found was there's a new common source that's creating significant amounts of stress. Here's the slide. It's a new one. The future of our nation, 63% of the people say they are in stress about this, followed by money, work, current political climate, and violence and crime. Another interesting thing revealed in this study, no matter your age or which generation you come from, more than half of all Americans believe that we are at the lowest point in our nation's history. Stunning, isn't it? Now, the survey tells us that stress levels are rising with every generation and every age demographic. Even the matures. You all know who the matures are? Age 72 and up. Someone's Rich is raising his hand. If you're over 72, you're very mature. But what the study tells us is even your stress levels are rising, and you all have typically done this. You've stayed even keel. Who do you all think is the most stressed out generation? It's the millennials. Millennials. The most stressed out generation. The researchers tell us that on a scale of 1 to 10, 3.4 is considered healthy. Millennials are at a 3.6 is healthy. Millennials are at a 5.4 and rising. Also interesting to note, the study tells us that 19% of all millennials battle depression. That is significantly higher than any other generation. And what the study tells us in 2017, so just August of this year, is that Americans are more likely to report symptoms of stress, which include anxiety, anger, and fatigue. Are you one of these Americans? Is your stress level rising? And see, you might have all kinds of opinions about why this is happening, why the millennials are so stressed out, why the matures are getting more stressed. And I have some opinions, and we might disagree and agree on some of those opinions, but here's what I can tell you. When I was in Africa 2 Sundays ago, sitting on that porch there in Zambia, it was a Sunday evening, and I was scrolling through my news feed, and I saw a story about what happened in Sutherland, Texas. Again, and this time in a church. It has something to do with the stress levels, doesn't it? And you can see how easily we can identify with that 63% who are stressed out about the future of our nation. And so you might be thinking to yourself, what does any of this have to do with Philippians chapter 4? What does any of this have to do with Paul's letter to the Philippians in the first century? Here's what I wonder. If the APA, the American Psychological Association, could somehow go back in time, back to the years of between 50 and 60 AD when Paul wrote this letter to the Philippians, and if they could conduct a very similar survey, would they find strikingly similar results? So we should be reminded as we're reading this letter that Paul wrote this letter from prison. And when we read through all 4 chapters, it's clear that the church in Philippi was pretty concerned about their leader. Remember, Paul started this church. He founded this church, as he did many churches. And they were stressed out about their leader and the future of their land and their people. Do you all remember why Paul was in prison? Acts chapter 16. The story tells us that there was a young slave girl, following Paul and Silas. Paul and Silas were traveling together doing mission in the city, and this young slave girl is following them, and this young slave girl, we're told, she's filled with the spirit of Python, which allows her to predict the future. And she was following them for days, and she gets louder and louder and louder, and Paul gets more and more annoyed, and finally he turns around and he casts the spirit out of her. And apparently it worked. Now, if she's a slave girl, that means she has slave owners. How do you think they felt about Paul casting the spirit out of her? So they began to accuse Paul and Silas of doing unlawful customs in the city, accusing them of disrupting the economic system. The text tells us that there was an uproar in a city, and the crowds began to shout and gather in, and the legal authorities have Paul and Silas stripped naked, beaten with rods, and thrown into prison and cells where their feet are put in chains. And see, this little church in Philippi might have been asking, what is happening to our world? Is this what things have come to? I mean, do you think they knew something about stress and anxiety and perhaps a bit of fear? Now, let's continue with a bit of context, because context is everything. So bear with me, because we're going places together. In the first century world, in the first century world of Paul, the Greco-Roman world, rejoicing was very, very common. So in cities like Ephesus and Philippi and Corinth and other cities in the Roman Empire, they would gather together and hold these huge festivals where they would rejoice and celebrate their gods. They would offer thanks and offer sacrifices, all in an attempt to get the gods on their side. Now, the pagan gods that they were celebrating, these gods were always distant. They were somewhere else. They were up there somewhere. These gods may or may not bless you depending on how committed you were, depending upon your obedience. Now, if you lived in first century Philippi, this small Roman colony within the empire, so keep in mind they had Roman citizenship. If you lived in first century Philippi, you were under the constant threat that Caesar, the one and true God, would come rolling into your town. And if this was the case, you were expected to literally bow down to Caesar. And you would be shouting things like, Caesar is Lord, King of kings, Lord of lords, Prince of peace, Son of God. They believed Caesar was the Son of God. Now, if you were in this first century church in Philippi, and you had audacity enough to not bow down to Caesar as he rolled through, but you stood up straight. If you had audacity enough not to shout Caesar is Lord, but Jesus is Lord, well, at the very least, you're going to lose all your imperial privileges of being a Roman citizen. And worst case scenario, you're going to be made an example out of, and you will face your persecution where you hang on this Roman execution device called a cross. I mean, do you think they knew something about stress and anxiety? What is happening to our world? And how does Paul respond? What does Paul tell them to do? This is how he closes his letter. Philippians chapter 4. By the way, when I started preparing this sermon last week, I was certain we were going to read the entire chapter together. And then as Wednesday came around, it was like, no, we're just going to do verses 1 through 9 because they're packed. And then as Thursday morning rolled around, it was like, no, we're just going to do verses 4 through 7 because there's plenty in there. And then as Friday morning rolled around, it was like, no, we're just going to do 4 through 6 because this is just packed and loaded. So we're just looking at 3 verses within this chapter. Read the entire chapter later to get all the context. But here's what Paul says to do. Rejoice in the Lord always. I will say it again, rejoice. Let your gentleness be known to everyone. The Lord is near. Do not be anxious about anything. I mean, given the context, do you see how packed full of energy this text is? Because what's Paul say to do in the face of stress and anxiety? Rejoice. I'll say it again, rejoice. And can you hear the people saying back to Paul, oh, come on, Paul, what do you mean? We should just do a public festival and celebrate God in our lives? Yeah, do that. And be reminded that when you celebrate God, our God is not like all those other gods. Our God is not distant or removed or indifferent. I mean, do you see how radical this phrase is? The Lord is near. Like, Paul is a sophisticated theological thinker. He doesn't just throw things around. The Lord is near. The pagan gods aren't near. They're up there somewhere. Paul's saying the Lord is near. Paul, how do we know the Lord is near? What's that even mean? Now, I don't want to jump to Advent and Christmas too soon. That's next week. But do you see how important it is? How do we know God is near? Because God was born into the world. How? Through a vulnerable little baby who was named Jesus, who then journeyed with the people through the stress, the anxiety, the fear, the joy, the celebration. God is near. And by the way, because of that, you don't have to work to get God on your side. God is already on your side because God was born into the world through the incarnation of Jesus. Now, we have to understand how countercultural what Paul is saying is. And did you know? In 4 brief chapters, Paul mentions joy 17 times. 17 times in Philippians. And it is not the kind of joy that is associated with just being happy all the time. It is not the kind of joy that just plasters a permanent smile on your face. That can be a little awkward. But it's the kind of joy that is rooted in something far greater than yourself. It's the kind of joy that says, no matter what you're going through, no matter what circumstances you are under, you can stay connected to the God who is near. You can have a rooted kind of joy. Do you remember what Paul said to those congregations in Rome in a book that we now call the Romans? Chapter 8, he said, what can separate us? I mean, seriously, what can separate us from the love of Christ? Distress, persecution, nakedness, the sword, even if they take our lives, what can separate us from the love of Christ? What can separate us from that rooted kind of joy? Paul's answer is nothing. And see, for Paul, how do you maintain that kind of joy? I mean, how do you combat all the stress, all the anxiety, all the fear? Let your gentleness be known to everyone. It sounds just a bit too simplistic, doesn't it? I mean, that's it, Paul? Let our gentleness be known? So let's look at this word gentleness. Gentleness in the Greek. You might have been wondering where that sermon title came from if you looked at your bulletin. Gentleness in the Greek is this really fun word to say, Epieikes. So I need y'all to say that word with me, Epieikes. But you can't just say the word because it is not a passive word at all. It is not a passive kind of gentleness. When we say this word, it carries with it some power and empowerment. It is very active and engaged. So when you say this word, you almost got to have your fist in the air and say Epieikes. So I need some fist in the air. I need some Epieikes. There we go. Epieikes. Now this word, it is loaded with all kinds of nuance. And I believe it is one of the greatest antidotes we have for stress, fear, worry, and anxiety. This word is used 5 times in the New Testament. Every time it's used, translators and interpreters and commentators, they're not exactly sure what to do with it because they translate it in so many different ways. When that happens, pay attention because that means this word is fascinating and it's taking us places. So if you look at different translations, when we see Epieikes, which we're translating as gentleness, here's how some other translations handle it. The KJV, the King James Version, uses moderation. The YLT uses forbearance. ESV uses reasonableness. And the Message, it's my favorite, He translates it as be on their side. That's Eugene Peterson, who did the message. Now, it's also important to notice, it's translated in lots of different ways, and it comes from this root word eikos, which means fair and equitable, and it comes from the same word where we get justice. Here's how the Message says it. I love this. Listen to this. Same 2 verses. Celebrate God all day, every day. I mean, revel in Him. Make it as clear as you can to all that you meet that you're on their side, working with them, not against them. Now, as I read dozens and dozens of commentaries and blogs and articles about this single word, here's the best definition I could come up with. Look, y'all might have been through some hard things. You might be going through some hard things right now. Keep loving people. You may have been burned. You might be carrying fear, stress, and anxiety. You might have lots of uncertainty about the future of our nation. Keep pouring out your heart to others, even when your heart has been broken into a million pieces, or as my 4-year-old daughter says, even when your heart is cracked. Keep pouring out your heart. And remember, everyone you encounter has a story. And you don't always know what they've gone through. So when they come at you with all that harshness, and they come at you seemingly from left field, and you don't know what's going on, well, you may not know what's going on. You don't know what they're going through. Let your gentleness be known. Epieikes. It is how we stay rooted in that kind of rooted joy. Epieikes. It is the best medicine we have for fear, stress, anxiety, worry. It's what allows you to keep pressing on in the face of fear, because how you treat people matters. It's what allows you to keep opening your heart even when it's been cracked, because how you treat people matters. And see, do you know people like this? Do you know people who have oriented their lives around epieikes, the truest kind of gentleness? So, I have traveled all over the world, literally all over the world, with Edie Worth. Where's Edie Worth? There's Edie. Edie, can you come stand with me? Now, do you notice Edie changed shirts recently? Epieikes. Hey, if you were in Zambia with us last week, would you stand? I know a couple of you are here, not everyone. So in Zambia, they have, just keep standing a moment. Everyone except for Jennifer's trueness. You can still stand. But in Zambia, they have these fabrics everywhere, thousands upon thousands of fabrics. And you go pick out a fabric, then you bring it to one of the lady tailors, and they make shirts. So all of these were handmade for us by women in $8. Mine was $6.
Yours was $6?
And look at Linda's dress. Check out Linda's dress. That was handmade.
I know.
Isn't it beautiful? Thank you all. You can sit down. Jensen, your shirt's beautiful too. I love it. So I have been all over the world doing mission work with Edie. Guatemala, Africa. We've had layovers in Europe. We've been all over the world together. And here's what I can tell you. If you haven't got a chance to know Edie's story and get to know her, I encourage you to do so. She is a woman who knows deep pain and deep heartache, but she also knows the deepest kind of joy and the best kind of celebration. And what I saw last week when we were in Zambia, I saw something extraordinary happen. Here's a picture of Edie and others. And I've seen Edie work with lots and lots of kids. She helps out downstairs in our St. Luke's Little School. But on this trip in Zambia, we were primarily working with women and groups of women who were coming out of the sex trade industry, or were attempting to coming out of the sex trade industry, and they were starting these small businesses, and they were doing these co-ops together, and they were encouraging one another and doing these small businesses together side by side. And what was amazing, what happened is Edie had this kind of healing Epieikes about her that I don't see often. She could go to these women and hug them, embrace them, and laugh with them and cry with them in the most healing ways. And it happened not within minutes or hours, it happened within seconds. She would have these ladies who have experienced a tremendous amount of heartbreak, whose worlds may have been upside down, and she would have them rolling and laughing, and you'd be embracing them. It was pretty powerful to see, and these ladies loved being around Edie. Is it true?
Yeah, they remember me.
You see, and stay up here with me because we're going to show something else. But Epieikes, the truest kind of Epieikes, it happens when we can go into those situations with a bit of fear and anxiety and stress because we don't know exactly how this thing is going to turn out, but you can still love fully. Epieikes says your heart, you could have been through hard things in life, some pain in your life and heartbreak, but you can still love without reservation. And Epieikes, it always invites us to step into our fears. And it's the thing that allows us to live with a certain lightness and freedom. So, on our last day in Zambia,
They all know already.
here we are. Don't give away spoilers. Here we are standing on the bridge, 365 feet in the air, overlooking beautiful Victoria Falls, which is one of the 7 natural wonders of the world. And Edie decides she's going to bungee jump. Now, one of Edie's famous lines in Africa was, "I'm 75 years old, but I'm not going to tell you my age." Edie, but actually they wouldn't let you bungee jump because you wanted to go with someone, and they wouldn't let 2 people bungee jump, so they had to have you swing. But regardless, you stepped off a cliff and free fell 365 feet. Here's a video of Edie stepping into fear, swinging across the falls. Take a look. Anyone experiencing some anxiety, some stress? My brothers and sisters, it's Thanksgiving week. And so as you gather with friends and family, in the midst of what you might be experiencing, if the research is true, the stress, the anxiety, the fear, may you remember to let your gentleness be shown. Let it be evident to who? To all. Let your gentleness, your Epieikes, show. Amen.